Welcome to the Making Sense podcast. This is Sam Harris. Okay, well, this week is the 4th anniversary over at Waking Up, and I wanted to share a bit more about why I've decided to put so much attention over there and to build the app in the first place. It seems to me that many of you in the Making Sense audience don't necessarily understand what I'm doing over there. When I was a teenager, after two people very close to me died, I became interested in certain esoteric questions, like what is the nature of consciousness, and what is a self, and what's the connection between the human mind and reality in the first place? How is it possible to understand reality? And how should our answers to such questions inform how we live? Now, these topics didn't just interest me philosophically or scientifically. I wanted to explore them directly through firsthand experience, which is to say I wasn't looking to merely know more or to believe new things. I wanted to live differently. And all of this culminated for me after my sophomore year in college, when I dropped out of school for what amounted to a full decade. This was the late 80s and 90s. And during that time, I made many trips to India and Nepal, where I got a chance to study with some of the greatest meditation teachers alive at that point. And I spent about 2 years on silent retreats, ranging in length from 1 week to 3 months. I also read very widely in the literature of philosophy and religion and contemplative spirituality, both from the East and the West. I also took psychedelics occasionally, more so in the beginning. And all of this served to fundamentally change my perspective on what was possible for minds like ours. So I came out of these years of seeking a very different person, and in many ways I found the experiential answers I had been looking for. But none of this amounted to making viable contact with the world, much less a career. So eventually I went back to school, where perhaps unsurprisingly I majored in philosophy. And because I was still fascinated by the core questions of the mind and its connection to reality at large, I then did a PhD in neuroscience. However, just as I was beginning my doctoral research, studying belief, disbelief, and uncertainty using functional magnetic resonance imaging, September 11th happened. And because I had spent the previous decade deeply immersed in religious literature, my concerns about the threat of fundamentalism were already very well formed. It really didn't take me more than 24 hours to figure out what we were dealing with, and to anticipate how confused many smart people would be by the problem of jihadism. The truth is, many are still confused by it. So I stepped away from my research at that point and published 2 books, The End of Faith and then Letter to a Christian Nation, which dealt with the Christian backlash to the end of faith. And in both of these books, I argue that faith and reason really are in conflict, and that religion and science, therefore, are in perennial conflict. And together with the biologist Richard Dawkins and the philosopher Daniel Dennett and the writer Christopher Hitchens, I became known as a new atheist and as one of the 4 horsemen of a new wave of opposition to organized religion. And all of this took some years to play out, and the resulting skirmishes in the culture war kept me away from my research for nearly 4 years. However, I've always been truly bored by politics, and most interested in those first questions that sent me to Asia and into the silence of the retreat. These questions about consciousness and the self and the nature of reality, whether we can know what is real, ultimately. For me, these are not divorced from everyday concerns. In fact, they directly relate to the most fundamental causes of human happiness and suffering, and to the larger question of what it means to live a good life. And ironically, they keep bringing me back to politics, which happens a fair amount on this podcast. My main concern at this point is to figure out how we can all live together so as to maximize the chance that humanity will thrive, now and in the future. So while Waking Up is often described as a meditation app, its purpose isn't just to help you meditate. It's to help you live a more examined and fulfilling life altogether. The point is to help you close the gap between the person you want to be and the person you seem to be in this moment. Now, like this podcast, Waking Up is run as a subscription business. However, also like this podcast, we've always provided free membership to anyone who can't afford it. You need only send an email to support@wakingup.com to receive a free year on the app. And this can be repeated as many times as one needs. Our business philosophy is pretty simple. Of course, we want to grow as a company and build wonderful things, but we never want money to be the reason why someone can't benefit from our work. We also give a minimum of 10% of our profits to the most effective charities, and this commitment to reducing suffering on other fronts has been central to our mission from the beginning. Now, perhaps you've tried meditation before and decided it's not for you, or you think all this talk about the nature of mind and the illusoriness of the self is just New Age mumbo-jumbo. Well, okay. But if you leave it there, you really are shirking the challenge I'm posing to you. Because my claim is that you have spent most of your life lost in thought. That is, thinking without recognizing thought itself as a process, and therefore not recognizing what the mind is like prior to identification with thought. And this status quo is the basis of all of your suffering. It's the mechanism by which disappointment and worry and regret and anger and sadness color your life. It's the thing that makes you bad company for others, and for the important people in your life whom you ostensibly love. It's what makes you an asshole when you are an asshole. And you are extraordinarily likely to spend the rest of your life in this condition, unless you look into the matter deeply. And it's over at Waking Up that I most fully explore this terrain. So yet another pitch from me to look into it, if you haven't. And as chance would have it, today's conversation is about death and how to prepare for it in practical terms. Now, death is something I've thought a lot about. I've always had a sense that I think about it more than most people. Certainly more than most people I know. I lost one of my best friends when I was 13, and my father died when I was 17. I don't think this is an unusual amount of exposure to death, but for some reason these losses were very formative for me. For as long as I can remember, certainly since I was 13, I've thought about death many times a day. Some of this thinking may have been morbid, but much of it's been useful. So I can't say I haven't wasted time. I don't have any important regrets at this point. In the last few years, I've been keenly aware that I've outlived my father. He died at 51. And I've often recalled what it was like for him to live his last year of a life interrupted by sickness and death. When I read or listen to authors or philosophers or scientists who I admire, I notice which ones are dead, and I notice what age they were when they lived their last day of life. And when I hear or read one of them say something about the future, I occasionally do a quick bit of math and realize this was a future they never lived to see. I enjoy old films and photographs, but not merely for what their creators intended. I also view them as rather vivid obituaries to the people in them. So more and more I live with a sense of the finiteness of life, and it's making me wiser, I think. I mean, we work and travel and eat and sleep and dream, and we repeat these things as though we might live forever. And yet one day we will die. There is something astonishing about this. I really don't think I'm afraid to die, though perhaps I'm afraid of the chaos and pain and indignity that might surround the process of dying. But as to the ultimate experience of finally surrendering my life in the world, I don't actually worry about that. And again, I would credit my experience with meditation and also with psychedelics for that. I do believe it's possible to run the loss of everything in emulation mode before it actually happens. You might see my description of what it was like to take 5 grams of mushrooms for more color there. However, losing the people I love is something that worries me. Paradoxically, it doesn't worry me that I will lose everyone when I die. I just worry that I could lose some very important people while I still have many years yet to live. And I'm also aware that I have at least a few people in my life who are very worried about losing me. So, anticipated sorrow haunts our living. We know we're going to lose people, and we know that others we love will lose us. We know, therefore, we will be givers and receivers of grief. What a strange situation. So much of my interest in meditation derives from this. How can we live truly fulfilling lives in light of death? How can we prepare our minds to lose everything? Well, among other things, by learning what it means to not hold on to anything. And what is it like to have a mind that doesn't cling to memories, or to hopes for the future, or to experience itself? That is really the essence of meditation. Meditation isn't, in the end, a practice you add to your life. It is the discovery of what it means to not cling to experience, to identity, to a concept of a self. What is that experience like? It's doing less rather than more. It is ceasing to do something you're doing by tendency right now. And if you can't find that experience of freedom now, it seems very unlikely that you'll find it later, amid the great unraveling at the end of life. Anyway, today's conversation is a very practical discussion about the unavoidable fact that life ends. And either you will die, and others will have to deal with the aftermath, or you will live long enough to have to deal with the deaths of the people you love. and then you will die. And there really is a fair amount of practical wisdom that can help you navigate this process. Today I'm speaking with B.J. Miller and Shoshana Berger. They've written a very compassionate and useful book, A Beginner's Guide to the End, Practical Advice for Living Life and Facing Death. And as I emphasized several times in this conversation, the conversation really isn't a surrogate for reading the book, because there is a fair amount of practical advice to give here. B.J. Miller is a hospice and palliative medicine physician who's worked in many different settings, and he now sees patients and families at the UCSF Helen Diller Family Comprehensive Cancer Center. He speaks all over the country and internationally on the theme of living well in the face of death, and he's been profiled in the New York Times and elsewhere. Shoshana Berger is the editorial director of IDEO, and she was a senior editor at Wired. She's written for the New York Times, Fast Company, Time, Wired, Popular Science, and other journals. She's also the author of another book, Ready Made: How to Make Almost Everything. And today we talk about preparing for death. We discuss the difference between palliative care and hospice, the tension between getting the most out of life and not clinging to experience. We talk about planning for death while still healthy, the importance of an advance directive, navigating the healthcare system, pain control at the end of life, assisted suicide, psychedelic therapy for end-of-life anxiety, and other topics. Again, this is a subject you might not want to think about, but I'm convinced you'll be better off if you do. And now I bring you B.J. Miller and Shoshana Berger. I am here with B.J. Miller and Shoshana Berger. B.J., Shoshana, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us, Sam.
So you have written a wonderfully useful book together, A Beginner's Guide to the End, Practical Advice for Living Life and Facing Death. But it will not be without trepidation that most people pick up such a volume. And I want us to just get into really everything relevant here. I mean, there's no way this conversation will be a surrogate for reading your book, because your book is filled with practical advice that really is better read than listened to in terms of the kind of checklist advice we want to have for people facing terminal illness or going through the experience of having a loved one face it. So we'll touch on some of that, and anything that seems super important, feel free to interject it, but it's just a note to listeners that there's more in the book of practical significance than we will cover here. But before we jump into the topic, perhaps each of you can tell me how you came to focus on death and dying professionally to this degree. How is it? Most people think about death, but you two have gone all in. Maybe BJ, we can start with you. How did you come to this topic?
Yeah, a couple different ways, Sam. Professionally, kind of co-evolved. For me, a lot of it starts with my own injuries when I was 19, sophomore in college. That's when I came very close to death myself. And that, was a real wake-up call, as you can imagine, to take life, take life seriously, but also playfully but really get into this thing while I have it.
It might be worth telling that story, however briefly you want to, because it's, people
Sure.
Might imagine that you were playing football and got a concussion or something more prosaic, but you had a fairly spectacular encounter with mortality or near mortality.
I did, but I'm chuckling because it reminded me of a moment in a restaurant long ago when I was wearing shorts. I'm a triple amputee, guys. I'll tell that story in a second, but very sweet, ancient woman approached me in a restaurant and said, tapped me on the shoulder and said, "Football injury?" And I didn't know how to answer. But anyway, so yeah, when I was 19, I was just horsing around with friends, and there was a parked commuter train just on the edge of campus sitting there, not moving, just sitting there. And we decided to climb it like you climb a tree, just kind of being sophomoric. And the power lines run overhead. And when I stood up, I had a metal watch on my left wrist, and the electricity arced to the watch, and big explosion. I was in and out of, it's close to death, burning it there in New Jersey for, maybe 6 weeks or so. In there a total of 3 months or so, but survived. Hello. But ended up losing both legs below the left hand and the elbow. So yeah, it was a pretty spectacular moment. That's the real imaginable crossroads in my life. That led me to medicine and an interest in life that included death, an interest in life that included loss and suffering, as well as joys and immutability and change. So that was very much my entree. That took me into medicine. At first I was going to do rehab medicine. Disability was the thing that I kind of walked in most interested in. What do human beings do when they bump up against things they can't change or can't control? And that was really the nugget for me. And from there, it was also entwined with death. But as I kind of got into it more and more, suffering, death, wanting to change, not wanting to change, this whole stew kind of begat palliative medicine that took me into hospice and palliative medicine. And from there, death became front and center with a lot of the hospice work. But even for patients who had plenty of life left, I was noticing that death, either metaphorical death or physical death, it could be this great prompt, this great foil. And so that is when I really began to work with it professionally to mirror what I was doing personally. So anyway, I don't know how short that was, but that's the gist of how I got into this.
And Shoshana, how did you come to this?
So it started as a very personal issue for me. I'd had a lot of exposure to death pretty early on in life. My college roommate OD'd, and I've had actually 2 boyfriends die of the same cancer, which is very odd. And then the kind of critical death for me was my father's death, and I met BJ just after that, and that's when it became professional. So we met at IDEO, the global design company where I work. At the time, BJ was the executive director of Evelynn Hospice, which is this beautiful residential hospice used to be located in a Victorian house in San Francisco, where people came for comfort and care and life. And as you may know, Sam, hospice carries a unfortunate stigma. Many people actually consider it to be a kind of death sentence. So BJ and his team came to IDEO hoping we could find a creative way to recast or effectively rebrand hospice in a way that would communicate its value, because it's really the most holistic, palliative, and free suite of care you can opt for at the end of life. And so when the designers at IDEO caught wind that we'd be working on designing the end-of-life experience, they were so excited about working on something that was so consequential and so poorly designed in American culture, largely because we live in denial of our own mortality and do everything we can to avoid thinking about it. So this idea of designing quite literally life and death was extremely exciting, and everyone wanted to work on it. Designers were throwing themselves into the volcano. And I ended up on a small team. We created this kickoff meeting to invite BJ in, where we actually built this tunnel that led from our office entrance on the pier at the bay in San Francisco to this dome-like structure built to fit a small group just sitting in the round. And internally, that meeting space became known as the Death Yurt. And on that first day, when we met BJ, we led him in through this kind of liminal tunnel, this passageway that terminated in this candlelit dome. And it had a transparent top, and it caught the flickering shadows of the candlelight. And we just wanted to create an intimate, safe inner sanctum for this conversation. And there were 10 of us there, and our assignment was to come ready to talk about how we design our final moments on Earth. So we started going around the room, and each person painted a more opulent picture than the last of what their final moments might look like. I mean, alone at the top of a mountain, or being surrounded by all your friends and family, but in a forest, or assembling your perfect curated death playlist. And I remember I was dreading my turn because I was fresh off of my father's death just 3 months before, and I just started at IDEO. And I wanted to join this rapture, but I'd witnessed my father's death as something so quiet and something that didn't remotely resemble any of these lofty visions. I mean, my father suffered with dementia and depression for many years, and he did not have an easy death. And by the time we got him on the hospice, he was mostly unconscious. He hadn't uttered a word for a year, and my last moments with him were, as I would imagine many last moments with loved ones are, just very quietly by the bedside, stroking his forehead and wetting his lips with a sponge, and whispering that I loved him, and scrambling to find a CD of Yiddish music because I knew those were the beloved songs of his childhood, and that, hearing is the last sense that you lose, hoping to hear that. So anyway, I was trying to square my experience with this exercise that we designed for kicking off this work with BJ and this on hospice, but my father's experience felt so undesigned and so over-medicalized and in many ways quite inhumane. And so when my turn came, I just said as much, and I broke into tears. And I remember BJ was sitting across the room from me and locked eyes with me. And I knew that he understood, as a palliative care physician whose work is to usher people through this human condition of suffering. He knew that that's what death looks like, and it looks nothing like what we see on TV. And often happens in an ICU and in a clinical setting. And so anyway, I came to understand that designing one's life and death doesn't mean that you can really control it. It means that you can come up with some principles for how to be true to how you want to live.
Well, so you've introduced a couple of terms here, and also a stigma associated with one of them. Perhaps we can explain this state of affairs. So, DJ, can you differentiate palliative care from hospice? And either one of you can tell us why there is such a gravity to invoking hospice care, and how we should think about that.
Yeah, sure. And Josh, maybe I'll define some of these things, and I'll leave it to you to understand how they land with the public. We've been wrestling with them. Palliative care, it gets so confusing, Sam. I really appreciate your question. I mean, people within medicine get confused about what that is. So it's really important. So hospice came first. It's an ancient idea. Really took off in modern terms in the UK in the 60s, came to the US in the 70s and 80s as a sort of non-medical, largely volunteer approach to care. And it was very beautiful. And in the 80s, Medicare got in the business and started paying for it in a novel way. And you tell me, Sam, we can take any little tributaries on policy fronts or whatever else along the way here. But since the 80s, hospice became an insurance benefit. So that's how we say we're on hospice. We're on the insurance benefit called hospice. So hospice has many meanings, but it is this kind of care reserved for the final 6 months or a year of life, say. But into the 80s and 90s, people who did this kind of work, one way and another, would kind of realize, well, why are we waiting till the end of people's lives to listen to them, to defer to their experience, to honor them, to tend to their comfort, to their peace, help them make meaning, deal with meaninglessness, help the families reckon and square what's going on and live on. It's beautiful, beautiful stuff, but it was, we reserved it for the final 6 months or less to live. So in the 90s, the idea was to try to break it free of the insurance designation, which is the thing that said 6 months or less to live, and you got to give up certain kinds of care to go on to hospice. All these kind of invented hurdles, man-made. And so in the 90s, the field of palliative care grew up. The term was coined by Balfour in Canada, and we were trying to always evade the baggage of the hospice designation. And also it's sort of attachment to death, because the whole idea is really to live well until you die. It's not about celebrating death or so. It's really about celebrating life and eking out all that you can while you can. So palliative care grew up in the 90s as a field to say, no, our work here is multiple disciplines coming together to mitigate suffering, focus on the experience of illness, the transactions of disease management, to help you suffer less and help you realize more joy. That's kind of the gist. So palliative care is now the umbrella term since 2006. The field at large is palliative care. Hospice now is considered a subset of palliative care that is this kind of multidisciplinary work, but still reserved for the final months of life. Whereas in palliative care, it's the same training. It's the same, you're a hospice doc as well as a palliative care doc together. But in my palliative care clinic, I'll see people for many, many years, or people who are in remission who aren't dying anytime soon. So, sorry for the long answer, brother, but that's kind of hard to do it succinctly.
So, but is it true to say that hospice only gets triggered once you admit, you being the patient, the family, in concert with the healthcare provider, that you're no longer doing anything to fight this illness and attempt to overcome it? You're not deliberately prolonging life at that point. What is it that you are no longer doing in order to invoke hospice?
So that's right. So you're pointing to the two main stipulations of the hospice benefit to qualify for this kind of care you pay for. Two things. Two doctors have to certify that your death will likely come in 6 months or less. It's a pretty bad prognosis, so it means that's death. And the second stipulation that you're pointing to is you have to essentially stop trying to combat this illness. So if you're dying from, say, heart failure, that's your hospice diagnosis. You can come into hospice. We will stop a lot of these expensive heart pumps and things like that are sustaining your life, or trying to cure or reverse a heart disease. That care then goes into instead making sure you're comfortable and working with you the time that you have to realize certain things in your life, etc. It becomes much more social, much more supportive, in a word. Rather than trying to fight the disease, you're trying to support the person. So that's the kind of segue of care. Your other diagnoses, if you have diabetes and then the other thing, that can continue to be treated. But the diagnosis that qualifies for hospice, you no longer qualify to push back on that disease. And in the 80s, that made a lot of sense. There wasn't, by the time you reached this point, there wasn't much more to try to beat your disease. Or by then, the person was really not interested in this or that treatment. It was too taxing, too toxic. It's getting a little messy now, but we have a lot of treatments coming down the pipe can help you live a little bit longer, a little bit more comfortably, but are not ever intended to, say, fix or cure your illness. So there's an increasing gray zone of treatments that might qualify from a palliative point of view, but don't from a hospice point of view for these reasons. So it gets really murky, and it feeds into this, that hospice is giving up. Because in some way you're giving some choices up.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Can you picture that?
So the question I posed about people's hesitation around invoking it sort of answers itself, because it comes at the moment where you have to admit that, okay, you're going to die from this thing, and it's no longer a story of how you're going to get better from cancer or whatever it is.
That's right.
Shoshana, did you have something you wanted to say there?
Well, I always look at the kind of etymology of these things, hospice and hospitals and hospitality. It's all about caregiving and how we care for people, how we care for each other, through the entire arc of life. And we pay a lot of attention for how we care for our firstborn, for how we care for children, and very little for how we usher people out of life. And, part of the project of this book was knowing that there was this book, What to Expect When You're Expecting, for new parents, which has sold like 500 million copies, and every set of parents gets their newly minted copy. We wanted to create something like that, a stepwise approach to thinking about this experience for the other end of life. And hospice is a part of that.
Yeah. So you mentioned, BJ, that you were at the Zen hospice. Does that suggest that were you a Zen practitioner before you came to it, or did you just come as a hospice doctor who happened to land at that particular hospice?
No, I came there more the latter, Sam. I came there for entranced by two things at Zen Hospice Project, which had started in 1987. I know you've had a beautiful interview with Franco Szezeski, who was the founding executive director. I mean, a really remarkable little place. And it had closed down after Frank left, and it was just reopening. So I came there as a hospice doctor, as an agnostic hospice doctor who was broadly interested in spirituality or just philosophy, how we approach the truth, how we approach life. So I was interested in Buddhism and had studied it a little bit and found it, irrefutable in so many ways. Didn't really see it as a religion, but more as a philosophy. And my agnosticism fit, I thought, pretty snugly within those confines. But I was really there as a hospice doc who loved architecture. And this sweet little guest house, this Victorian, was sort of anything but a nursing, anything but a hospital. Sort of a belief or an observation that the bones of the place, all of that. Of course, I was there for the house, and I was there because they had a basis of care in volunteerism and in spirituality. And that seemed like very interesting, perhaps a larger, better attachment for this subject than the sort of reductive medical model per se.
Shoshana, do you have a background in meditation or any spiritual practice that's informing your approach to this?
Well, Sam, I largely learned to meditate from you.
Oh, yeah?
I have to give you credit here.
Oh, nice.
Someone gifted me a subscription to Waking Up, and I had dabbled in meditation before, and growing up in the Bay Area, you can't help but like osmotically be exposed to all of the Buddhist activity around here, and we have Spirit Rock here, and so I had a yoga practice, and certainly I was interested, but really it wasn't until I started having you in my ear that I started more religiously meditating. And but I do say that for me, the death of my father was such a tectonic shift for me, and it so rattled me to the core that I did turn to various different spiritual guides and faiths. I certainly turned back to my Jewish community, and I listened to a lot of very wise teachers who grapple with loss and death and grief in a way that I think is very useful. To me, the Tibetan practice of meditating on death 5 times a day, I think is really right. Is that you should keep death close, because of course it is everywhere, and we are dying all the time. And having that inform how you live, it that has changed my life. That has
Mhm.
brought more urgency to my life. It has brought much more connection, more presence. And so I think that's all very useful.
Yeah, yeah. Well, more or less every spiritual tradition recommends that we keep death in mind. And, it's the impermanence of life that motivates most philosophical reflection or deliberate practice that's aimed at wisdom. But it's always seemed to me that there's a paradox or a seeming paradox between the kind of two modes of response to this reflection. I mean, there's the mode in which we can really seize the day with a sense of urgency and follow a sort of carpe diem piece of advice, which is just alone can be a kind of just a further adumbration of our attachment to things and clinging to things. I mean, there's no bucket list, however fully accomplished, that's the same as recognizing a quality of mind that just doesn't cling to experience and to life itself. And so I think there's this potential trade-off and confusion between the urgency of trying to get the most out of life, which again, there's a lot to be said for that, but that's distinct between simply recognizing that this moment is already enough, right? And I think more and more we want, I mean, certainly anyone with a meditation practice will find this familiar. We want a mind that is at peace with experience, whatever it is, and is at peace with the reality that we're at bottom, we're not really in control of anything. And it's these kind of nested illusions of control that we sort of fight our way beyond as we confront our and others' mortality. So I'm wondering if either of you have any reaction to that, because in my own life, I noticed that I really am running both programs. I mean, there are many things I do because I want to do them, and I have vacations planned and projects planned, and there is a sort of bucket list mode of prioritizing things that, on their face seem like good and enjoyable uses of time. And I wouldn't say that is a waste of time, but if you are living with the illusion that your happiness is going to be secured, only when you arrive at the peak of all these mountains that you're planning to climb, you seem guaranteed to be disappointed. And then there's sort of a figure ground reversal that needs to be accomplished, where you can recognize, well, it's possible to be already happy before anything happens, before the vacation actually arrives. It's only worked out for me in continually kind of being buffeted back and forth between those two modes and recognizing that one needs to supersede the other for me.
Yeah, oh, Sam, you're really putting to something really important here. And I think in some ways, Shoshanai, the book in some ways as a beginner's treatise, or, we mostly, sort of suggest or come up to find our way to, oh boy, okay, time is finite. My time is finite on this planet. And okay, let's take life seriously. Let's figure out let it distill what we care about, and let's pursue those things that we care about. There's something really beautiful and wonderful about that. One of the things, if we were going to write like an intermediate guide, I think we'd spend more time on, like a second book, like, squaring the limits of that approach along with like the limits of the self, and if you just stay in yourself all the time, you're only
Mm.
going to get so far. That would probably be the sort of second big book. But you're right on. I think, and as I've kind of gone down this road myself or in my work, I am increasingly tuned into, and it's always a dynamic, just as you're saying, Sam, of this other piece of what, of learning to be okay with what already is. Preload your happiness or your peace, and then work from there. Don't, this idea of hedging, leveraging your current peace for some better peace or more happiness down the road. This kind of, I used to do this a lot with myself, and I do it less and less, to sort of leveraging the present for some possible future. And so I think what your point is just perfect, Sam. It's really not one or the other. It's not being or doing. It's really, I think the project ends up being cultivating the good judgment to pull on the right tool, and to not see these as a dichotomy. It's not being